So, where does that leave us? I think each of these stories tells us a truth about things, but unfortunately I think it leaves us muddled. I think it leaves us in fury and dismay. We are dismayed at the people who are involved in our political lives to some large degree. We can't believe how some do it and how others don't. We can't believe that some laws are passed and others not. We can't believe that social injustice is not represented by some people, et cetera, et cetera. So we have all of these things where we're thinking, man, how could this possibly be? Right? We just, when we're flooded by the news in all the different countries of the world, it's just so, you're there, okay, the Communist Party is doing this in China, and it's everywhere you turn, okay, you have the juntas in Burma, you have this and that, and you think, man, this place is a mess. Okay, so we are in dismay. The human condition seems to be a condition of dismay. On the other hand, I still think that we are left with a fury, because we are driven by an understanding. This is a philosophical drive. We are driven by an understanding that we need to live together. And we need to sort that out. We need to try to practice justice. Okay? But it would seem that we're schmucks. Okay? If Geiges is any rule here. There are issues about whether philosophers are worthwhile. You have Pangloss, you have Martin. But in his own right, wasn't Candide kind of philosophical? Wasn't he kind of doing a philosophical life of some sort and moving toward a wisdom? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. That's not clear to me necessarily. Right? So these stories nonetheless do tell us about humanity in a way that is important for us to hear. That is a good. That is a benefit that philosophy brings to us. It does bring to us clarity like this. But frankly, I'm not sure that it helps us know how to live. That I'm not sure of. All right, so Max, you want to do questions?
Yeah, well, just like philosophy raises questions, I think, more than answers. I'm wondering, like, whether someone has a question now, open like some discussion, see what you think of the story, or you perhaps disagree on anything. I don't know who.
Dr. Ekman, do you believe that philosophy has, or should be playing more of a role in terms of education when it comes to making politics better?
They're going to think that I paid you to ask that question. Come on. Right?
Well, maybe you will later on.
No.
Preemptive.
That was like a bribe happening here. Now that's a great question because it's a no-brainer answer. I have an absolute, me personally, I have an absolute commitment to education. Because in this respect, I very much admire Thomas Jefferson in America. Remember that America has a very different political model than anything that the world saw up until this point. Okay, that all the political models that were there were some kind of a hierarchical model with a top-down structure. The Americans will create a model for power, okay, for political power, for society, in which power is completely fragmented. It's fragmented among people, like real Tondis sitting in the world. And they live at every different point of belief that you can possibly imagine. But the only thing in Jefferson's mind that could warrant that kind of a creation as a political structure is what? Education. They must be educated. It is inappropriate. It is unacceptable for me to give you real power if you are not educated. You must be educated. And so the Americans had the first mandatory education system on the planet because the citizen had to be educated. Now, very particularly, he said they have to do civics. In other words, they have to understand kind of what the political stuff is about. He said that they must study history so that they can see how power is permuted, he says, is transformed from power into tyranny. So we need to have our students study history, which is one thing that we try to get rid of in America now. We want them to study maths and science. We don't want them to study history. That's one of the programs that we tend to cut in periods of budget crisis, right? And then Jefferson also wants us to study philosophy. He uses very precisely that word. By that word, though, he means ethics. Ethics, do you know what that means? No, it's not I'm sorry, it's not a rhetorical question. Ethics has a very clear meaning to philosophers. It means how we act in the world. Aristotle translates this word ethics as praxis. He calls this a practical philosophy that happens to the citizen in the politia, in the community, in the polis, in the city. So in other words, ethics for Jefferson very clearly meant how we act so that we would have an understanding of how we act in the city as citizen philosophers. Right? So the answer is, of course. This is an absolute, and remember the model for Roosevelt is based on an American model of the liberal arts, of general education, which actually is derivative from Thomas Jefferson. I love the model because we have a chance to create the next generation, don't we? Okay, so even if this generation is completely knackered, right, we have a chance. I'm creating the world through my students. I don't know what world you're going to create, but I'm trying to help you get a start here. Yeah, absolute. Great question, Bob.
To what extent do you think that education keeps up supports the noble lie, or that it actually makes it able to see through the noble lie?
Yes.
Which side are you on?
Both. It happens through the conventions of state. Okay. It absolutely happens through those conventions, but hopefully you teach or you help the young to get to a point of discernment about what is good to keep and what is good to not keep. And that's the way that they will differentiate themselves from their society in order to identify how they can contribute to their society. Okay, so both of those things, Max, are true. It's not a polarity. Yeah?
You should teach in the second chamber in Holland.
Okay.
That would be very necessary.
Okay. I don't know what that means, but I think, is that good? Is that good?
For you, it's a House of Commons.
Is that good?
I'm sorry.
So would this be a good?
It would be more than necessary.
Would they
The ethic.
Would they want to kill me after one day?
Probably.
No.
Funding to Roosevelt. Okay, I love it.
I see questions in all corners. Laurie, you were...
Yeah, I had a question which is sort of related to what we just discussed, because what I found interesting is that both in the first story, the person or the man who makes these silly choices or is corrupted is called either a simple man or a naive man. So, I mean, I know about Plato had a very distinct idea about who can be a citizen in a society. I'm not sure about Voltaire, but I was just wondering what that means in who can be a philosopher. Because if we follow these two stories, then the people who are naive or simple should attend to their own garden, and we should leave it up to these people, maybe as Voltaire, to take the lead in being a philosopher. Does that support your idea that we should, education is important so that everybody can be involved in this, or does it actually give a very elitist idea about who is able to be a philosopher and who's not, and make the right choices or not? Does that make sense?
Well, no, so one question, I'm sorry, I'm looking, the Rolodex is going because I just read something on that this morning.
Because, for example, Plato didn't really recognize women in that respect, for example.
No, okay. A very clear answer to the question is the Western tradition has always maintained, of thinking about the world, has always maintained and tried to support the aristocracies. Okay? Absolutely. In fact, I was reading about, I think it was about Plato just this morning, that the idea is that, remember, Plato is not a Democrat. Okay, he is not interested in real people like you and I having power. He thinks that the power belongs to the educated. He thinks that the power belongs to the wealthy, belongs to the wise, and that they are the ones who will come up with laws to enable justice to occur in the state. I'm absolutely sure that Voltaire would not dispute that. He is not a revolutionary yet. Okay, And frankly, the French have always loved their aristocracy. Homer, the world that is depicted in Homer's world is an aristocratic world. There's no doubt about that. So the idea of an elite, of course, that goes without saying. Now, I'm not defending elitism in the absolute, but frankly, the American political model has certain interesting challenges. Okay? Because when you distribute power into real people, this guy over here, he just wants to fix vacuum cleaners. You know, he doesn't want to be bothered with questions of state. Okay? And so somehow or another in the American model, you have to get this guy who just wants to fix vacuum cleaners, you have to get him interested in and involved in questions of state. So that when the education system begins to fail, he loses interest because he's only interested in fixing his vacuum. Now, is there anything wrong with fixing vacuum cleaners? No. But he still has real power, even though he doesn't necessarily want to play in things of state. So this is when the model starts to disintegrate. So there is an elitism in the history of Western thinking. The Americans were the first to adopt a very clean model in opposition to that type of elitism. But you're discovering also in the American way of doing things that there is a financial elitism. There is a classism in America that is based strictly on dollars. I'm not trying to justify that, I'm only recognizing it.
Well, would you still like to raise your question?
Yeah, a bit more of a philosophical question. You kept on stressing how people have this notion that they need to live justly and justice in the world, but at the same time, all of these stories show that people are schmucks. So how do you kind of understand this seeming paradox?
What are your choices? Your choices in the world are truly Odyssean, aren't they? Your choices in the world are, let's all live like the Cyclops. Where will that take us? Okay, these are real choices. I think the earliest Greek philosophers understood that and the anthropologists kind of substantiate that we are social critters. We are social animals. That means to say that the individual has to take into consideration the group, and that mandates that we must conduct ourselves in certain ways that are fair-minded. Okay, so I think it's just kind of the way of nature took us here to the consideration. I think that seems reasonable, kind of off the top of my head. Did that satisfy you?
Somewhat.
He's been more demanding in class.
So a question next to you as well.
Well, talking about the Cyclops and the basically the citizen philosopher of Voltaire, isn't Voltaire actually pointing at the Cyclops kind of life? Because he's saying, go mind your own business. So he's saying, go live the Cyclops life, basically.
At first blush, I would agree. But here, you know, Voltaire is kind of like Socrates. Suppose that you went to, have you ever been to a comedy show? Have you heard of a comedian? Okay, it's not a personal when you go to a comedian thing, right, and you hear this comic and he's standing up there and he gives his couple good jokes and you're not laughing yet, and he'll come out and he'll say, boy, you're a bunch of bright lights, aren't you? Does he actually mean that you are bright lights? Is that what he means?
Irony.
It's irony, okay? And so Socrates and Voltaire are notorious for irony. Irony actually is inviting us to read the opposite from what is said at face value, so that we should not read at face value. Now, and I think that makes these stories very complex, because then you're not at all sure what Voltaire means.
Yeah.
Right? And so I say, again, it's a bit muddled. I'm not suggesting any definitive interpretation of the Candide, only that these are stories that tend to take us someplace, for however we see that.